All right, we are now live for the AMA for August. So, as people are streaming in, I'll say just a few things. First off, welcome to everybody. It's kind of a cool month. It's always a big one for me. It's my birthday this month later on. It's also kind of a somber day for me because as I got reminded as I woke up this morning, it's also the anniversary of my dad untimely dying when I was a kid and he was quite young. So that's always a little bit somber there. But it's a beautiful time of the year. A lot of cool stuff going on. We're getting ready for the academic semester to begin again. We've got a couple questions here already. So I'm going to bring them up and start answering those. So this is from Old Calypso. I'm currently studying Plato's Laws on my own. Any advice or things to keep in mind? Would also be interested to hear of any insights you're especially enamored with from your own study of the text. So I can say to answer the second, I don't have any insights I'm especially enamored with. But what you can say about the laws, it kind of depends too on like, well, are you studying it after having read some other Platonic dialogues? Are you doing the laws first? I don't know enough about that sort of stuff, but it is his longest dialogue, and a lot of the commentators on it, their point of view is like, listen, Plato did all this dialogue writing over the course of his long career. And in the laws, he's like saying, I'm done screwing around with having you figure things out. I'm going to lay it all out. And it is, very long. It's not universally well liked. I think in part because some people are like, how do we reconcile what's going on in the laws with what's going on in the other dialogues? That to me is not that big of a problem. I don't have an issue with Plato saying one thing in one place and another thing in another place, and there being, possible tensions or contradictions between the two. So it really depends on what kind of reader you are. If you're somebody who needs complete consistency, Plato might not be the philosopher for you in the first place, but he is. It's called the laws because they're trying to figure out how should society be arranged, oriented. It's, we could say, more realistic than the Republic, but there's, again, Plato scholarship is all over the map. What is the Republic supposed to be about? Is it a just kind of a joke? Is it a real proposal for how society ought to be organized? Is it somewhere in between? And I think the answer is it is somewhere in between. So, the laws are much more programmatic, I would say. And, if you're reading the laws, well, you already know because you've opened the book, because you are reading it on your own. It's quite a long haul that you're going to go down. So, but it's encouraging to read that you are checking it out. So it's a great work. All right. John Flemings, do you dare to hope in the sense of von Balthasar? I don't know what von Balthasar says about hope because I don't read much von Balthasar. So do I dare to hope? Sure, because there's many other people who talk about, hope, including Gabriel Marcel, who is, one of the main thinkers about it in the 20th century. And I'm willing to bet von Balthasar drew on him quite a bit. And sure, yeah, I've done discussions of it. Actually, recently I was on a podcast talking specifically about Gabriel Marcel and hope, and actually recently talking about Alistair McIntyre and his 7 traits for the future and hope. I think hope is an important thing for our lives. So, yeah. All right, not an academic has a longer question here. I'm studying Sartre's Critique of Dialectical Reason. I'm feeling a bit overwhelmed because I'm not sure how dialectics work. I know we can't make probably clear and simple definitions, but how does one apply the Hegelian dialectic, or how Sartre calls it affirmation negation and the negation of the negation? What are the basics to understand dialectics? Well, there is no basics to understand dialectics. When people talk about dialectics, what they typically mean is X person's understanding of dialectics. Dialectic is a term that is already there in Plato, and then it's used by Aristotle with a different meaning, and then it comes to be used by the Stoics, and it comes to be used by medieval thinkers who often mean different things. And then, later on, we see it in Kant, where it's a bad thing to have a dialectic. And then we see it in Hegel, and Hegel doesn't ever give you, here's the primer on dialectics. So, long story short, by the time that you get to 20th century thinkers who are influenced by people like Hegel or Marx, and then their interpreters, there is no nice, neat, easy thing of dialectics. Certainly this idea of affirmation, negation, and negation of the negation is one thing in it, but I would say it's a mistake to look for like the key thing that dialectics is. I mean, even in Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, you see how dialectics works by going through the text itself. And I mean, you could say that one thing that is there in dialectics is that while thesis, antithesis, synthesis is all bullshit and doesn't actually work that way, certainly not in Hegel, although Marx likes that and Engels like that. There is this sense of you posit something, and then out of it, in one of many different ways, will come something that is opposed to it. And then maybe it will be a negation of a negation, or it will be something that brings them together, or both of them will show themselves as being wrong, and there'll be another third thing that you have to go down there. So there isn't like a nice, easy answer to this that's going to help you. And each person is kind of doing their own thing, I would say. Useless projects. In your last Q&A, I asked you about Noam Chomsky. You commented on not agreeing with his ideas about language, linguistic theory. Could you go more into detail and give your thoughts? Yeah, I mean, it's pretty straightforward and simple. Chomsky is essentially, thinking that there's some sort of like basic structures out there. And I don't think that that's actually the case. And when I read enough of that, I was like, well, I don't have to fart around with this guy anymore. So, it's pretty trivial, that sort of thing. Octalol, I am new to philosophy. Where should I start? Should I buy a course, or should I study from your lectures? And which lecture of yours should I start? There is no answer to that. There's no should. There's no needing to start here. The best thing to do, you don't even have to start with my stuff. The best thing to do is just start reading, knowing that you are probably going to only get, a certain percentage of what's in the text that you're reading. You're going to have to come back to them. You don't have to worry about the right starting point in philosophy, because you're not going to stay at the starting point. Instead, you're going to proceed and, make some gradual, cumulative progress, and it will be piecemeal, and you'll start seeing connections between things. I mean, if you were going to like start with my lectures, which you shouldn't anyway, you should start by reading philosophy. If you're going to use my lectures, you should use them in conjunction with actually reading the texts that they are about, So, I mean, there's myriad places you could start. I have these videos on self-directed study in philosophy. You could check those out. You could take some of my course videos and, like the intro to philosophy or the ethics class, or you could, You could start with, if you want to do chronological, the very earliest core concepts on Heraclitus and Parmenides and go forward from there. But you don't have to. There's no like right way to do it. And I think a lot of people often think that there is. Um, there isn't even necessarily a right way to do it in other disciplines. I mean, obviously, if you're going to do, say, mathematics, you got to learn some algebra before you're going to go on to pre-calculus and calculus. But there's no one single like course of study that is the best to pursue, even in convergent disciplines like mathematics, let alone philosophy. So, all right, le petit caperal, kind of an interesting spelling of Monsieur there. What do you think of antinatalism? Not much. I think it's kind of a, silly, dilettantish kind of thing. I've always, people have been asking me about antinatalism for about 15 years at this point. And, obviously I practically didn't take it seriously because I had some kids. If I was an antinatalist and I thought their arguments had much to them, I wouldn't have had kids, right? But I think that a lot of it is just kind of posturing and silliness. I actually think pessimism in general is often people finding rationalizations for the shitty attitude that they have about things that, it's not as if there aren't a lot of bad things in life, but to make sweeping assertions like it's all bad or nothing's ever good or we can never be happy. How the hell would you ever know that? I mean, how would you know that any more than the other, big sweeping statements like, God has a plan for everything or it's all good. I mean, these are all very dogmatic assertions that people make. And, when you start looking at the arguments that people provide, which you should do, right? You find that there's a lot of assumptions being made and a lot of dogmatic assertions. And, what do I think of it? I'm always a little suspect of people who center their philosophical thinking on that and not the many other things that we could be doing. John Flemings asks, is there any type of philosophy class you haven't taught but wish you could? Okay, so that's a great question. Yeah, I mean, in the course of my time, I have been mostly teaching things that we call service classes. And I've, rarely had the opportunity to teach things to specifically philosophy majors, high level classes. I haven't ever been able to teach a graduate level class just because I haven't been in the kinds of places where that was an option for me. But, I could easily teach graduate level seminars on a number of interesting topics. But, sticking to the lower level, I will say one of the big failings on my part over the years has been that I teach at a Institute of Art and Design, and I've never gotten around to designing and teaching an aesthetics class, which really ought to be there, right? It's this place, Milwaukee Institute of Art and Design. So that's probably a glaring thing. And you say, well, why the hell didn't you do that? I'm not really a specialist in aesthetics. I mean, I've taught some stuff and I do some work, but I'm not like a deep, that's not a big area of my specialization. I probably really do need to get around to doing that someday. But I'd like to teach classes that were focused on a specific thinker for an entire semester. That could be kind of fun. But in point of fact, the world of academia is not really merit-based or fair or anything like that. Much depends on being lucky and being in the right place at the right time, or having, gone to the right school. Right meaning like prestigious, not actually necessarily the best place or anything like that. So, but that's part of why I have my study with Sadler Academy. Like right now, I'm teaching a class for learners on Stoicism and the cardinal virtues, and working on a book project on that. So if I want to teach classes, I don't have to be stuck just with what an academic institution will allow me to. All right, so we got a couple longer things here all connected together. Socrates' great grandson says, I enjoy helping people figure out things related to academics and career goals. Leaving out details, a jealous female at my job has spread rumors about me to management. I'm essentially a seducer of women. Management has threatened my job if I continue to talk to other females about anything non-work related. What would the appropriate stoic and or virtuous response to the situation? Well, I mean, first of all, not calling women females would be a great start. Anytime I see somebody routinely doing that, I'm usually, sensing some red flags, and probably other people are. So maybe, what you would do if you were going to try to be virtuous, and if you were going to be, following stoicism, is you would say, wow, I wonder if there's anything to this, or if I'm just saying that somebody is jealous and they are, um, you know, causing trouble for me. Management, you say, has threatened your job if you continue to talk to other females, or you mean women, about anything non-work related. Well, then if that's the conditions of your employment, look for another job, or don't talk to women about stuff that isn't work related until you've like built up a good reservoir of goodwill with other women who will have your back. Because I'll tell you, if something like that were going to happen to me, I would have tons of colleagues who would be coming forward and saying, no, this person is being right. They would rightly identify that person as jealous. But that's because I talk to men and women the same way, and I don't like classify people as males and females. I mean, that's right off the bat gonna like sound a little weird to a lot of people. So, all right. Allison says, given that Aquinas deeply engages Aristotle within the Christian framework and the Stoics offer a compelling ethical vision, how do you see the interplay among Stoic ethics, Aristotelian virtue, and Thomistic moral theology? Where do they most converge or diverge beyond the religious aspect? Well, you're right that Aquinas deeply engages Aristotle, and he does have a Christian framework. Aquinas also deeply engages many other people, including the Stoics, because he has Seneca available to him and all sorts of stuff from Cicero. And he gets the Stoics wrong in certain respects. For example, in the treatise on the passions, he says that the Stoics think that all the emotions are bad, and clearly he's wrong about that, but that's okay. But he's also engaging all sorts of other thinkers who, church fathers who have read the Platonists, the Aristotelians, the Stoics, the Epicureans, like, for example, Lactantius, or, Chrysostom, or John Damascene, who's an Aristotelian later on. So, that all kind of, you think of Aquinas less as like this, takes Aristotle and puts them in a Christian framework. The Christian framework is very complicated. So, for example, Thomas Aquinas is very different than many Christians of today in that when he talks about stuff from Scripture, he doesn't quote chapter and verse, because that isn't something people did back then. He's not a fundamentalist, like proof texting or anything like that. He's got like biblical passages, and this is, by the way, is not just Thomas. This is very, very common to Christian thinkers. he will often say, aha, so what's going on in this philosophical discussion over here is similar to what's happening over here, but Christianity takes things a bit further, or rather, the teachings of Jesus or the apostle, but meaning Paul, or, what the prophets were saying, like Isaiah or things like that. He will try to bring those together. Obviously, there's going to be some things where Thomas views Christianity as going beyond what the pagan philosophers had to offer. And so, yeah, that's a good point. But Thomas is also pretty receptive to trying to get as much as he can out of whatever wisdom the ancients are offering. And it's good to remember too that people like Aristotle are also engaging with their predecessors. So, sometimes people are like, oh, philosophy is this long conversation. It's not just that, but there is a lot of, like, when you talk about Aristotle, you're not just getting Aristotle, you're also getting Aristotle's reaction to Plato and the various pre-Socratics and discussions about the rhetoricians of his time and stuff like that. But Thomas is getting his Stoicism primarily through Christian thinkers prior to him who have something to say about the Stoics, like Augustine. He's got all of Augustine's works available, and Augustine has a lot to say about the Stoics. He's got Boethius, and then he's got all these other, thinkers like Seneca, Cicero, who are, giving him bits of Stoic doctrine as well. Interestingly, also through Seneca, he gets some discussion of Plato that's not available otherwise, because they don't really have a lot of Platonic texts until later on, other than the Timaeus. All right. Dean Rose. I found the short story Alria by Borges beautiful. Borges' wife, Kodama, put from Alria to Javier Altalar on his tombstone. Do you have any plans to take a deeper dive on this short story? Not at present. I don't remember much about it. I read it once a long time ago, but frankly, I don't remember enough about it to say. I do have plans to hit some other Borges stories, more, close in time to this point. For example, the Immortal, that's going to take a few videos to do because it's a very long story. And I've got some others as well, the Aleph I need to do and stuff like that. But before I go back to Borges, I need to make good on doing the next Philip K. Dick novel, which is going to be Scanner Darkly. So it's going to be a while before I do more Borges, probably. Le Petit Caperal, not to press you about antinatalism, but that is exactly what you're doing. But why do you think it's silly? I personally think it's when you take a sober look at life, it's almost self-evident non-existence is better than existence. Well, I think that's silly. And I think that you're being very dogmatic, and it's probably motivated by other stuff that you're just rationalizing as, yes, this is a philosophy that makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, if it makes a lot of sense to you, that and you're like, yeah, man, I respond to this, that's probably a good reason not to buy into that philosophy. I mean, it's the same thing when people are like, oh man, soon as I read Stoicism, I realized I was a natural Stoic. And I'm like, bullshit. You are not. You probably haven't read the text adequately. And it's more like you were looking for something that agreed with your ideas already, right? So, I mean, if you're an antinatalist and you see that most people are not antinatalists, and you don't automatically dismiss them as being in delusion or full of crap or something like that, that probably should be an index to you that maybe there's something off about that whole system, right? Just like if you're into Hegel and you're like, Hegel knows everything. And then it turns out you find a lot of things that Hegel can't account for. What do? Do you double down and say, oh, Hegel seems so smart, the world must fit that? Or do you instead say, well, maybe, I don't have to throw it all away, but these sweeping assertions, maybe those are wrong. Maybe, it's not quite so simple and straightforward. All right. Brian, I love your videos on existentialism. What piqued your interest in that? Do you feel more aligned to existentialism or Stoicism? Have you read the Substack Existential Pulse? He's quite good. Yeah, I mean, that is a former student of mine and colleague who I've actually had on the video channel, Andrew Robinson, doing an Ideas That Matter interview about grief. So yeah, I do read it, and it's recommended by my Substack, and I've shared him as well, and he shared my stuff. So I do, in fact, know him, and he is quite good. Andrew's a really thoughtful guy who I like quite a lot. So let's take the, do you feel more aligned to existentialism or Stoicism? Stoicism is a coherent body of doctrine. Existentialism is not. And anybody who tries to tell you that there's something called existentialism out there that could be compared to Stoicism is either ignorant or full of crap or trying to sell you something. Existentialism is a loose movement that includes a lot of different and sometimes not, entirely on the same page people. So, for example, is the world meaningless? Is it absurd? Is it ambiguous? These are all different ways of talking about things. And you're going to get a different answer from Simone de Beauvoir, who has a whole book, The Ethics of Ambiguity. It's ambiguity, right? Not absurdity, as opposed to, say, Camus, and people can quibble, oh, he's not an existentialist. There's a whole conversation to be had there. Yes, he does fit into the broad thing that we call existentialism, but he also criticizes people that he calls existentialists, like Leo Shestov and Gabriel Marcel and Jaspers and Kierkegaard for making the leap and stuff like that. So there isn't like a existentialism that you would feel more aligned with rather than Stoicism. And do I feel more aligned with either of them? I draw on both of them pretty extensively. I have been reading existential thinkers since I was a teenager, not necessarily understanding everything I was reading, but certainly, I was interested in them. I think for the same reasons a lot of other smart teenagers are. The world is full of a bunch of phonies, and social conventions, and success don't seem to be providing you with what you want. And you're looking for something deeper, and you're attracted to the fact that people are writing about things that matter to them, right? And it's stuff that you can relate to, about love and sex and death and loss. And, it's easy to see why there's a perennial interest for adolescents, teenagers, early 20-somethings about existentialism. But then, as it turns out, and this is what I discovered as I reapproached these texts as a grown adult, some of them have great depth to them. Some of them suffer a bit. Sartre, I was really big on him for a long time. Now, maybe less so. I like Camus a lot more than I used to. Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Shestov, certain, parts of Dostoyevsky, I appreciate much more. Gabriel Marcel, I certainly appreciate more than I did as a 20-something. And it's because they're touching on perennial themes. And I really do enjoy teaching both about Stoicism and existentialism, but I'm an eclectic. I draw upon lots of different philosophical points of view. All right, so we got a lot of, here we go. Javier says, was Spinoza's conception of God really that different from the ideas of God that were around before him or contemporary to him? Yeah, his idea of God is really quite different. God or nature, understood as, having infinite attributes, only two of which we grasp, thought and extension, and everything else is merely modes of that. Yeah, that's a pretty different conception. And you might say, well, yeah, what about other pantheists? Like, what about, John Scotus Erigena? Well, I mean, read Erigena and read Spinoza and see how much they actually come together. It's not that much, or, well, what about other rationalists? Well, I mean, the other rationalists, it was very common to say, here's how my doctrine differs from that of Spinoza, who we all agree is wrong, right? So, yeah, he really was doing his own thing, I would say. And that's part of why he wasn't really welcome anywhere, except in a very small community. So, not so Oedipus. How do you handle a curiosity which drifts and swivels, going round and round between different thinkers, topics, and even writing styles, but is quite consistent in the content attracted to? Well, the way you're describing it, I'm not sure what you would need to handle. There's a follow-up here. How would you suggest a person with such a curiosity to manage it, and with what resources? I mean, if the problem is that you feel like you're not sticking with something long enough because you're attracted to something over here, you are saying that it's the same content, right? The same basic topics or problems. So, like, for example, let's take Stoicism. So you get interested in Stoicism, and let's say it's because you read Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, which is perfectly fine, but you start to realize that Marcus is just the tip of the iceberg, and that there are greater thinkers than Marcus that you could be reading. And you find out that one of them is Seneca. And so you buy Seneca's letters and you're like, oh, this is really cool stuff. It's much more complicated and systematic than what Marcus was talking about. And he's also talking about all these other thinkers, like what does Aristotle think, or Plato, or Posidonius, or Epicurus? This is really cool. And then like somebody's like, yeah, but you haven't read Epictetus yet, have you? And you're like, no, I'll go read Epictetus. And you read the Enchiridion, and you're like, oh, that's really short. Let me read the Discourses. And you're like, oh, wow, this is really interesting stuff too. But he's very different than Seneca. I mean, Seneca's constantly talking about virtue. Epictetus, not so much, unless you know how to read between the lines. And Epictetus talks about, the will, the proairesis, and Seneca, not so much. You start reading around, and then you're like, you shouldn't just read Seneca's letters. You should also read On Anger or On Benefits. And you're like, oh yeah, let me go do that. And then you discover, holy crap, there's also Musonius Rufus. I'm going to go read his stuff, and then somebody's like, well, if you want to know about like Stoic theology, you really want to read Cicero's On the Nature of the Gods. He's not a Stoic, but he's got a Stoic in there. And you're like, oh yeah. So like you're putting your books aside and going from one to the other. Well, if what's happening is like everything that you've read is just dropping out of your mind as you're going along, well, that's a problem, right? And maybe then the goal is to like stick with something for a while longer. But if instead you're like, I'm accumulating all this stuff and it doesn't all have to make like total sense to me. I don't need every single Stoic author to be on the same page as everybody else, but this is really interesting. I'm getting a composite picture developing. Well, that's a very different sort of thing. So I don't know, maybe you want to keep notes of like who you're studying and what similarities they have to each other and where they're different from each other, and which one you think is better and which one worse. Yeah, that could be helpful. Another one from Not So Oedipus. Is there any thinker you find yourself saddened by people's appreciation of? Saddened, no. And back in the day, if I was going to feel a feeling about that, it would not be sadness, it would be anger. But I don't really get angry about that sort of stuff anymore. I would say that I think there's a lot of people out there who read kind of like second-rate popularizers of various philosophical positions, who may have podcasts or stuff like that, and they're like, "Yeah, this is really the person for me." And I mean, am I saddened or angered by it? No, but why should you waste your time dicking around with those people when you could be reading Hume instead, or Mary Wollstonecraft, or somebody better? Um, but it's a free country and you get to read what you want to read. So I don't really worry too much about that. And I kind of think that at any given point in time, the majority of people are going to be reading schlock that won't be read by people 100 years from now. Because that's often been the case. Aspire Nova, I'm 18 years old. I've passed my 12th grade. I want to write, publish philosophical papers and books. Please recommend some material if there's any. And I'm not in any university. How can I publish myself? Well, there's good news and bad news. So publishing yourself has never been easier than today. You can easily go on and Google how to publish your own book, and you can do so through Amazon publishing. There's all sorts of vanity presses out there that will, if you pay them some money, they'll work with you to do that. That's the good news. If you want to publish your own book, super simple to do. The bad news is, if you're not actually like spending plenty of time studying philosophy, you probably don't have anything interesting to contribute that people would want to read. So probably, if you're 18 years old and you just finished high school, and you're not going to go study at, college, and even if you do, should you write your own book as a undergraduate? Probably not, because it's probably not going to be very good. Um, but you can do what you want. I mean, is there material? You can Google and you can find out how to publish your own stuff. But I think it's like any other thing. If you want to be a good writer, you need to read a lot of other people and read good stuff, not stuff about how to publish your book, but read, actual philosophy, and start building up your sort of repertoire from there. So yeah. All right, John Flemings, do you have any advice on how to stay calm when someone insults you or someone close to you directly? Should one remain calm in such situations anyway? Yeah, you're probably better off remaining calm than blowing up at them. There's all sorts of anger management techniques that are out there that you could check out. I mean, Seneca wrote an entire book called On Anger that you would find dozens of useful practices and reflections that you could apply. Plutarch has a whole book on controlling anger. I've actually got videos out there covering the whole of those books. So I think there's plenty of resources that you could turn to, but there is no like one size fits all piece of advice, because it depends on the situation, the kind of things that set you off, what you're struggling with, what sort of considerations work better for you. But on the whole, you're probably better off staying calm than getting worked up about stuff. And by the way, that's pretty common across virtue ethics, whether they're Platonic, Aristotelian, Epicurean, Stoic, Christian, something else. It's generally better to stay calm. So, hey, Mark, good to see you here. So we're just talking about colleagues. So Mark is one of my colleagues, as is Andrew, the existential pulse guy. So got kind of like a little community of people who have studied philosophy extensively and try to do work bringing it to the public. That's what Andrew Robinson does. That's what Mark Smith does. That's what I do. So, all right. Let's see here. Another Le Petit Caporal, speaking of Dostoyevsky, which novel of his is your favorite? Mine is Crime and Punishment. Mine is definitely, it's either translated as The Demons or The Possessed. That is for me the best of his novels. A lot of people hold out for Brothers Karamazov, and there's some cool stuff in there, but I don't know. I find that such a slog. There's a lot more going on in The Demons. And you could say there's a lot going on in Crime and Punishment, and there is. But I would say that The Demons has like a wider range of perspectives examined and engaged in. But one of the cool things about Dostoevsky is his characters don't just talk philosophy, they live it out, right? They're like, I'm going to experiment with this. I'm going to see what these ideas actually lead to and how they change things in the world. I'm very, very attracted to that. And that's important for existentialism, by the way. So, yeah. All right. Blank name. Which Deleuze work would you recommend people start with? That's a tough one. I mean, it kind of depends on what you're looking for. So I think there's four ways you could go with this. I think one of the very popular ways would be to read Deleuze partnered with Guattari, and to read either Anti-Oedipus or Thousand Plateaus. Those are the books that I see people like, we're going to do an Anti-Oedipus reading group, We're all going to become bodies without organs. A very unclear concept, by the way, in that work. I don't actually advise that any more than I advise beginning Hegel by reading The Phenomenology of Spirit. I think that Anti-Oedipus, like The Phenomenology of Spirit, like Spinoza's Ethics, they are what I've called in the past texts with auras, where people are more about like showing off that they're reading them and throwing a few concepts out there, but not usually understanding them because they're difficult works and may not be entirely coherent as well, right? Ironically, I think, like if I had to say where to start, it would be one of Deleuze's later works, like I think it's translated in English as Essays Critical and Clinical. It's, Essai critique et clinique in French. And the reason I would suggest that is there's two reasons, really. So one is Deleuze is giving you some really interesting takes on other people's works and the ideas that they provoke for Deleuze. Like he's got an essay there on Bartleby the Scrivener, right? I've done some videos about that, or on the difference between the Gospel of John and John of the writer of the Apocalypse, or all sorts of other cool stuff as well. And they're short. You can like read this one, and then you don't need to read this other one over here to understand what he's doing in this essay. That might be helpful. There's also all these like history of philosophy books that he wrote. And, there's Leibniz, the one on Leibniz called The Fold is really quite good. He's got his Nietzsche book, which is really interesting. I think is actually quite a good, I'm pretty sympathetic to his Nietzsche interpretation. He's got a book on Spinoza. He's got a book on Bergson, book on Hume. You could take those, and if you've read The Other Person, you could be like, okay, I know what Deleuze is talking about here. Let's see what he does with this. Like in the Nietzsche, the concept of force is really important, So, but then another possibility would be to start with a bigger book that is also engaged a lot with other thinkers. It's not polemical in the way that like anti-Oedipus is, and polemical in a way that you got to know something about like the French psychoanalytic establishment and culture to make sense of. So the book that I would probably say is good to start with, that's straight Deleuze, not Deleuze mixed with Guattari, which I think is not great, is The Logic of Sense. I think that's a really good one. But, is there like a Deleuze for beginners book? Not really, right? So, here's a very interesting one. Aspire Nova. Is it possible to read all the primary texts written by all philosophers throughout history? No, it is not. So you're not going to read everybody. And let's say you started now, as you say, and only focus on original works, not secondary or commentary works. You're going to forget 90% of what you've read, and you're probably going to try to like speed read or speed run through some of them. And that's not a good way to read. You cannot read everybody who's available, and you probably couldn't even back in Hegel's time. You certainly can't by the end of the 19th century, let alone the end of the 20th century. There's just too much stuff out there. So, you've always got to do a bit of triage, you could say. Silver Squirrel, have you read The World as Will and Idea, World as Will and Representation by Arthur Schopenhauer? Yeah, I have a number of times. My question is, what are your thoughts on it? I was getting ready to read it soon. I just finished Studies in Pessimism. Yeah, it's a really interesting work. I've actually worked with students in tutorial sessions going through the entire work in recent years. Yeah, I like Schopenhauer. He's a great writer. He makes some pretty dogmatic commitments at certain points that I don't follow, that ultimately lead him to his pessimism. I did, by the way, get to study. I took a graduate level, or audited at a graduate level class with Wolfgang Schirmacher, at that time president of the International Schopenhauer Society, Association, whatever it was. I was a resident scholar at European Graduate School, and so they gave me the opportunity to take a class, and I was like, well, I'm doing that one with that guy, And just to like put it in perspective, the other people that were available were people like Zizek, but I wanted to do like a real Schopenhauer class with a real Schopenhauer scholar who had some very interesting interpretations, which, by the way, he talks about the gray Schopenhauer, the pessimistic Schopenhauer of the sort of standard take. And he proposed a Schopenhauer Blanche, the white Schopenhauer, who's not so pessimistic. And he made a very convincing case for that. And he was drawing a lot on, World as Will and Representation, but also the Foundations of Morality and some of the other works as well. So, yeah, I think Schopenhauer is a great thinker. Sometimes he has some cool stuff to say, for example, about the importance of compassion, Mitleid, in morality. At other times, he's rather schematic and dogmatic, and you're like, yeah, okay, I see where you're coming from, but I just don't buy your starting points. So, all right. Allison, I'm deeply interested in how we can better form character and virtues in young people, especially elementary and middle school age. What advice would you give? Are there traditions you think offer the most practical and effective models? Are there thinkers you recommend introducing young people to, and ideas related to virtue you wish young people knew more about? Yeah, so I actually do have a lot of thoughts on that. So the first thing is most of the curricula that you're going to find people developing and pitching out there about virtues, and I'm going to use quotes for that, for elementary and middle school, is pure crap. And you should run away from that stuff. When people have flashcards for virtues that don't actually, for the 56 different virtues, and a wheel and diagrams, it's all bullshit. It's just like the most watered down, not really virtue ethics, but parasitic upon virtue ethics stuff out there. I'll also say that a lot of the stuff that's coming, because people on the progressive liberal side aren't usually interested in virtue talk. It's often conservatives, and they'll be like, think about William Bennett and his garbage book of virtues. Not very good stuff. There's often a very strong rigidity to people who claim that they are using Thomas Aquinas or Aristotle or whatever. And you realize, looking at their materials and talking with them, that they've read those people, but they didn't really understand them that well. So I think if you wanted to teach kids about various traditions of virtue ethics, you really need to know the literature well. So if you're going to, teach them about Aristotelian virtue ethics, you can't just read the Nicomachean Ethics, and you certainly can't read it just once or twice. You need to have studied it and really thought through the stuff in book 3 and book 4, where we get into the nitty gritty about the virtues and what they look like. But you also need to have read the politics and the art of rhetoric and book 4 of the topics and the poetics, and you need to put together sort of a comprehensive picture. If you want to talk about the Stoics, you need to really read the Stoics, and they're harder in part because there you're reading in 2 different languages, Greek and Latin, and there's no like one central thing on the virtues for them. You have to piece together a composite picture. Are there traditions that you think offer the most practical and effective models? Yes. Platonism understood properly, which means not just reading Plato, but also reading Plutarch. Aristotelianism, Stoicism. We could say Epicureanism, but we don't have enough material on them. Too many texts have been lost. Christian virtue ethics, you really need to begin back with the church fathers, not jump way ahead to Aquinas. You need to read the people that he was reading. And then you can put together good stuff, and then you can do the work of saying, okay, so for young people, obviously I'm not going to have them reading, Summa Theologia Prima Secundae or something like that. We've got to like digest this for them and figure out what kind of examples in their own life does this relate to, like how to divide the cupcakes, or what is it like to be generous with another person, or what does proper anger control look like, So I think that's promising. You can do a lot with that. And by the way, I'm a big advocate for doing that with kids, but it's got to be done right. So it's not done in a cookie cutter schematic sort of way that just gives them, stuff without roots, you could say. And I will say this, narrative, really, really important, not just for kids, but for lots of adults as well. And Alistair McIntyre, I would read some Alistair McIntyre because he has devoted some thought to those sorts of questions. But I would also read things like, there's other authors out there who talk about education in the virtues and narrative, like Paul Ricoeur or Wayne Booth or people like that. All right. Let's see here. Brian's got a follow-up. Just so I'm clear, existentialism is a loose movement of thinkers that are lumped together. No, it's not just a loose movement. They're lumped together because they have common themes, right? So an existential perspective is that philosophy applied. Existentialism is not a philosophy. It is a set of philosophies that have commonalities with each other. So, that's probably, you got to shift your mind to that sort of thing. There are people who, like John Paul Sartre, who will be like, here's the definition of existentialism. It is the doctrine that says that existence precedes essence. And then the other existentialists are like, no, man, that ain't what we mean by it. Who died and made you king of the existentialists? So it just is what it is. It is a movement of thinkers who have some common themes that they're working from, many of whom read each other and are responding to each other. So it's that kind of thing. Blank, I'm picturing a world in which you get recurring TV pundit gigs. How far-fetched is this? Pretty far-fetched, unless like somebody, I don't know, somebody out there is an agent and they're like, yeah, we got to get this guy on TV pundit roles, or somebody starts, I don't know, some sort of campaign or petition. I think a lot of TV pundit stuff, they want people who are nice, easily digestible talking heads who spout talking points or say funny things. I'm more prone to like, think about stuff rather than just say, well, as we all know, or something like that. So I don't see that happening anytime soon. So yeah, but if somebody wants to start like a campaign to try to get me on TV, I'd go on TV. I've been on TV before, right? Let's see. Not so Oedipus, how far does your interest in Bergson extend? Is there any interest to speak of at all? What have you read of his? How did you find it? Was it convincing? Did it play a role in your philosophical development? Yeah, I mean, I liked Bergson. I thought there were problems with his points of view. I do really, really like his early work, the essay on the immediate givens of consciousness, which is typically translated as time and free will. I actually did a whole independent study over a summer on Bergson with my mentor in graduate school. And I've read my way at one time or another through all of his works. But I've never been like a Bergsonian. I was more interested in looking at, what his position had to offer. And I'm interested in his role as sort of so Bergson, backing up a little bit, Bergson and Maurice Blondel before him, but also at the same time, and then Gabriel Marcel a little bit later, but around the same time, those three guys played a massive role in revitalizing metaphysics in French philosophy, which was very oriented towards kind of a positivist point of view or neo-Kantian point of view, and in preparing the way for phenomenology to make its way into France. Bergson's, focus on the immediate givens of consciousness, Blondel's method of immanence, both are phenomenological approaches to things. So I think they're he's quite interesting. He's not somebody who I do much work on these days. So yeah. All right. Phenomena librarian, any other philosopher besides Cicero who you think is a model on how to do eclecticism in philosophy? Yeah, I mean, Seneca is pretty eclectic. He's willing to draw upon the Epicureans, who are like the enemies of the Stoics. And Seneca is a Stoic, and there are certain Stoic doctrines that he's committed to, but doesn't completely buy into and tries to find ways to make sense of. But he also knows a lot about the Aristotelians and the Cynics and the Platonists and Epicureans. And he even like brings up, different Stoics and how they disagreed with each other. Where Posidonius and Chrysippus have different points of view. So Seneca's pretty good with that. He's also perfectly willing to say, the Stoics are wrong about this, like thinking that the virtues in our souls are living things in our souls. He says that here's some arguments why that doesn't make sense. I would say if you're inclined to read early Christian thinkers, that although they are working within a Christian framework, a lot of them are quite eclectic when it comes to drawing upon philosophy. And I would even say that Augustine is that way. But other people who are deeply involved with philosophy would be, I mentioned Lactantius, and Boethius is kind of eclectic in different ways. He doesn't identify strictly with a school. He's pretty Platonist, but late Platonism is itself eclectic. It incorporates stuff from the Stoics and the Aristotelians. So yeah. And I guess you could say that there's some thinkers in the modern age who show that they can draw upon a variety of different thinkers in interesting ways. I think David Hume kind of does that in some respects. Alistair MacIntyre, he eventually becomes an Aristotelian Thomist, but to be an Aristotelian Thomist, as far as MacIntyre is concerned, does not mean carrying around a card as an Aristotelian Thomist. It means being within a tradition and trying to take what's good from Kant or from Mill or from Jacques Lacan or other people like that. So maybe he's a good example as well. Hobbit. Oh, this is a good question. One that I'm not very good at answering because I don't watch a lot of other people's videos because I don't have the time. Which other philosophy channel besides yours do you recommend for those interested in philosophy without compromising quality? Yeah, I don't have any great answers for that because I'm not regularly watching other people's stuff. So I don't know. I think a lot of times there's compromising quality going on. Socrates' great grandson. Why is formal logic typically required for an undergrad philosophy curriculum? Would an informal logic argumentation be more useful for the development of critical thinking? Well, formal logic isn't necessarily typically required for an undergrad philosophy curriculum. It varies from place to place. And quite often it is an informal logic or critical thinking class which is offered. But interestingly, if you go and look at an informal logic or critical thinking class, guess what will be a part of it? Formal logic. So it's not so, like, well, we only do it this way or this way. Think of it more of a continuum. And there's nothing wrong with studying formal logic. And informal logic, what most people remember from it is the fallacies, and you're going to get that in a formal logic class anyway, because that's part of the curriculum for that. So I don't think that it really depends on like who's teaching it, which textbooks you're using, how it's integrated into other classes. That's probably more important than what the individual class is. Akram, what's the difference between being and existence and Heidegger's philosophy? Depends on which work you're looking at, right? So you can say that if you're doing be with a capital B, that means like the being of beings. And that's something that Heidegger thinks that everybody reduces to a region or type of being. And existence is like, existing outward into things. What's the impact of his analysis on the way we see the history of philosophy? Depends on whether you like Heidegger or not. I would say that at this point in time, many people, in the way they see the history of philosophy has got no connection to Heidegger whatsoever. And other people really love Heidegger. So there is no we there because there is no consensus about how to do philosophy. William Zen, what are your thoughts on how to develop and maintain intellectual rigor in your writings and thought without being out of touch with the common people? Well, that's a good question. I would say I'm at an advantage for being in touch with the common people in that I didn't come from an academic family, but rather a family that in my mother's generation and back before that were all tradespeople pretty much. And then there were a lot of people who did go to college in my generation, but they weren't going to college to become, professors. They were becoming engineers or, teachers, elementary and high school, or nurses or things like that. So that will help to keep you grounded. Going to academic institutions that were not high prestige also helps you not to like write off ordinary people. I've always been somebody who talks with the people who I'm, involved with, whether they're cleaners or secretaries or, other people that many other academics would just not relate to, or they would condescend to. My mother was a secretary, so I know that being a secretary is pretty damn important. And I have no illusions about how easy it is to find yourself, working jobs that are not, particularly academically oriented, because I did many of them in my life. So that's an advantage right there. I doubt that I'll ever be out of touch with common people, because sort of like Socrates and sort of like Alistair McIntyre, I'm really interested in people and I like talking with them and finding out what their life is like and what their job is like and what's going on and what they care about. So that's one side of it. Now, the maintaining intellectual rigor, I think a lot of academics think that they have to like, and they preach this to other academics. Oh, you got to water things down and make them simple for ordinary people. They like bullet lists. That's really important, right? And in point of fact, how the hell would they know? A lot of these people who give advice about that are very out of touch. As it turns out, provided you're not talking to them in just a condescending way, like you're the big sage on the stage, and you can use like examples that are relatable and language that they can, wrap their head around quickly. You can do stuff that's very rigorous without having to water it down or compromise it or anything like that. And I think, there's quite a few people who kind of bullshit because they think that's what ordinary people want, but ordinary people don't want that. They do want to be challenged intellectually, at least the ones that are going to tune into a philosophy podcast or show up at an event or do a workshop. They want some real meat there. And so you give it to them, but you give it to them understanding that you're going to have to do some work on it. You're going to have to extend yourself. All right, not so Oedipus. How far does the study of Blondel go if it's taken exclusively in English when it comes to a healthy, useful image of his philosophy, or at least a given phase of it? Well, right now, what you have available are a lot of his early writings. So you can certainly do his early phase. There's, two translations, one of which is great, one of which sucks. Axiom 1893, which is the work that made him, most famous. So those are good. There's also a great intellectual biography of him by the translator of the L'Axiom 1893. That's good. Oliver Blanchette, very important Blondel and Hegel scholar. Fiacre Long, years and years ago, translated The Idealist Illusion, The Logic of the Moral Life, and a couple other early essays. I translated 4 pieces by Blondel in my book, Reason Fulfilled by Revelation, the 1930s Christian Philosophy Debates in France. And before he died, because it's been a little while since he passed away, Oliver Blanchette translated a very, very late work of Blondel, which I don't know the English title, but it should be something like the, Exigences or Demands of Christianity, the philosophical demands of Christianity. And that's basically it as far as I know, unless somebody's brought something out that didn't get my attention. So you can get a lot of early stuff. Some of the stuff from it hasn't been translated, has it? The Semaine Sociale. Yeah, the Semaine Sociale, the early stuff having to do with the modernist controversy. I'm leaving something out. the Letter on Apologetics and History and Dogma, translated a long time ago by Illit Trethauwen. So the early stuff you can definitely study. The middle period, it's basically just the stuff that I translated. The late period, it's just the one book by Blanchette. And there's lots and lots of stuff that just hasn't been translated. I do have a translation that I did years ago of Patrie et Humanité that's in rough shape and needs to be redone. Very relevant work from the 20s about nationalism. And maybe I'll get to that eventually, but yeah, it's a problem. And the good news is, though, all the Blondel stuff should basically be out of copyright at this point in time, because he died in 49. You get 70 years after the author's death, unless they died doing meritorious work to France, which I don't think is the case for Blondel, in which case you get 100. So since he died in 49, in 2019, his stuff should all be in the public domain and not need any permissions to translate. So, let's see here. Blank name, what's your view on effective altruism, the organization that still actually works to help people and not insane? Is charity better given to UNICEF since it's global? I mean, the idea behind effective altruism is you should give to the charity that seems to be doing the best work. So it doesn't matter whether it's global or not. It matters how much of their stuff is going to the actual people that need to be helped. But I mean, effective altruism as a movement and organization, it's really kind of sad to see. They got into all sorts of crazy sidelines, had a big sexual harassment problem, seemed to have catered a lot to conferences for rich people and crackpot theories. And I don't get it, because it comes out of utilitarianism. Jeremy Bentham would look at this and be like, what are these chuckleheads up to? You know, I think a lot of them basically used it as kind of an excuse for indulging in the kind of stuff that they wanted to do, with a, sort of veneer of utilitarianism. So, but real effective altruism, the basic idea that you should, if you're going to be trying to promote happiness, you should do so in a way that's effective. Why would anyone have a problem with that? I mean, that's sort of a no-brainer. But it turned out that the organization that was supposed to do that didn't do a very good job of it. So, yeah. All right. Luke says, after a recent trip to Austria, I've been thinking about how Protestant ideas overlapped with economic practices. Do you think our economic practices continue to shape moral concepts and vice versa? Yeah, of course they do, but not in a simple way where you can be like, yeah, this is the the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism. That's very, very broad, big picture stuff. And people have pointed out all sorts of flaws with that. Anytime you say Protestant, well, which kind of Protestants do you mean? Calvinists? Well, what kind of Calvinists do you mean? So sure, our economic practices shape moral concepts, vice versa. It's always been that way. But it's a very complicated thing, and I don't think we can easily generalize about that. Let's see here. Blank says, dig your classic metal class. Would love to see you do some sort of collab with another classic heavy metal guy, Nate Garrett from Big Riff Energy Podcast. Yeah, well, suggest it to him, and maybe we'll get in touch. I don't know him myself. Collabs are usually me bringing on people that I know quite well, or that Scott knows quite well, like, Buck Dharma, when he came on to do an interview, or my friend and colleague, Rob Coulter, who actually teaches a philosophy and heavy metal class, or our friend and colleague, Ken Blackwell, who was like there on the scene in the new wave of British heavy metal. So, yeah. All right. Let's see. Not so Oedipus. Any secondary literature or histories of philosophy which you find as valuable as primary sources? Something like Klasowski's Nietzsche Vicious Circle or Lang's History of Materialism. Yeah. So I wouldn't say there's any history of philosophy that, like a broad history of philosophy, that I would say is as valuable as primary sources. But secondary lit on particular thinkers, where it's like a real work in its own right. I mean, that's where Heidegger and Deleuze and people like that really do stand out. I mean, Deleuze is so both with Heidegger and Deleuze, when you read them on a given thinker, you're getting about 50% that thinker and then 50% Heidegger or Deleuze, right? Maybe even 60%. But what they have to say is very interesting. Sometimes they're wrong, but they're always wrong in interesting ways, right? I mean, you could also say like Alistair MacIntyre's After Virtue, and then, the other three books in the tetralogy. A significant part of what he's doing is narrating a history with reference to primary thinkers, but those books are worth reading in their own right. So yeah, I think there's probably plenty of things out there like that. Akram, can you recommend to me a book or books or philosopher that talked about love deeply and thoroughly? Yes, as a matter of fact, I can. And as I put at the very top, I'm teaching a 1-day seminar on one of the early books in Western philosophy that did so, Plato's Symposium, one of the greatest dialogues he ever wrote. It's got 7 interesting speeches coming at different perspectives on love, from, a rhetorician to a medical doctor to a comedian to Socrates telling the story of the wise woman who taught him everything he learned about love, to Alcibiades bursting in drunk and saying how he tried to seduce Socrates. So that's a great one, and I'll put a plug in for that. So I'm teaching a special seminar, 1 day, 3 sessions, 90 minutes each, online on Plato's Symposium. There is tuition for it. It costs $99, but everybody who takes my classes says they're well worth the money that they cost. And we are going to be going through this. So there's that. Then Aristotle has stuff to say about love. Plato has other texts as well where he talks about love. Comes up in many other thinkers. Particularly if we extend love to friendship, Cicero has an entire dialogue on friendship. Plutarch has all sorts of stuff about love, and it continues on all the way well into the 20th and 21st century. There is one thing I will caution you about, and this is a bit of a side note. So C.S. Lewis has this book, The Four Loves, and I'm actually teaching a class on love and friendship at Marquette University this coming semester. So we're going to start out by looking at Lewis's breakdown. The Greeks recognized 4 kinds of love, and they had different names for all of them: eros, romantic love or erotic love; philia, friendship; storge, affection; and then finally agape, self-giving love. That's bullshit. The Greeks did not distinguish that. As a matter of fact, when you read something like Plato's Symposium, you can see that he's using these terms quite often with overlapping meanings to them. That's later on that people say stuff like that. So you do want to be careful about those sorts of things. But Lewis's book, The Four Loves, is actually quite good. I've taught it in classes about love and friendship in the past as well. So, all right. Socrates' great grandson, what's your view of the philosopher Rosalind Hursthouse and her book titled On Virtue Ethics? I haven't read that book. I've read a few things by her. She has a decent article on Aristotle and the mean, where she rightly points out that there's much more to the mean than just a numeric middle thing, but perhaps goes a little bit too far in some respects. I'm very leery of the people who pretend like virtue ethics was, revived in the 20th century, because it never went out of people were talking about virtue throughout the 20th century. They just weren't in Oxford and Cambridge, where a lot of these people came from. So, All right. Blank name. Have you read Rabindranath's Thought on Education? I have not. Um, Not an academic. How are you feeling about Ozzy's death? It doesn't really affect me the way it seems to affect a lot of people. Um, Ozzy is somebody who I used to listen to a lot, still like those first four albums. Not so big on the albums after that, frankly. The Zakk Wylde stuff, I never really got into. And, he was an old guy, had Parkinson's, did a lot of drugs over the course of his life. Surprised he lived as long as he did. And, was it a great loss? I mean, Ronnie James Dio was a great loss. Lemmy was a great loss. I don't know that Ozzy was. I mean, he sang, he was a decent singer. He didn't compose most of the lyrics that he sang. The only instrument he ever played was the harmonica. Basically, he was surrounded by talent by his wife, Sharon Osbourne, a manager, who often ripped that talent off. We can talk about Bob Daisley and Ken Airy, and J.K. Lee, and all these people that should have had royalties and songwriting credits who didn't get it. I understand that a lot of people have very strong emotional attachments to Ozzy. I didn't. By the time that I was a teenager and, listening to Blizzard of Oz, Diary of a Madman, Ultimate Sin, and Bark at the Moon, one of the common themes that I was like, man, this guy, he can't make an album without whining about being misinterpreted and persecuted. I like the stuff he did with Black Sabbath. I like those first four albums. I think there are other people who are much more important, band leaders, composers. You compare him to Ronnie James Dio. Ozzy was a normal intelligence guy. Ronnie James Dio was very brilliant. Ozzy didn't play anything. Ronnie James Dio could play any of the instruments that his bandmates did, and would sometimes get up and be like, here's what I want you to do on the guitar, Ozzy didn't write anything really. Ronnie James Dio did. Ronnie James Dio was a band leader. Ozzy was a figurehead. So, some people are probably going to be pissed about me saying that. But, we got to be, I don't believe in being disproportionate about stuff. It's not the end of the world. It's not an end of an era. When Ian Gillan dies or Rob Halford dies, those are some singers where I'll be like, oh, wow. Yeah, that's a big deal. When John Lord died, massively important force in Deep Purple. That was one that hit pretty home, or Ken Hensley of Uriah Heep. Those are some big ones for me, but nobody's as big for me as Dio was. What a great loss that was, All right. John Garrell, to what extent and how would you say that different epistemologies relate to each other in everyday life? How relevant do you think the incompatibilities between different perspectives of knowledge are? What issues do you see with it, and what is a good way to go about it? I'm not even sure what that's even asking about. So I don't do a lot of work in analytic epistemology. We don't typically talk about different epistemologies, except maybe when we're doing social theory and we're talking about epistemological injustice or stuff like that. But I don't do much with that discourse either. So I don't really have much to say about that. Tayton says, are there any historical figures, politician or philosopher who's a great negotiator or practitioner of politics like Cicero that you like? Oh, it's a good question. I don't really focus that much on figures in political philosophy. I think a lot of that's overblown. People love to read a biography of, the founding fathers and the decisions they made about this or that. But I don't do much of that sort of stuff. Usually it'll be like, I like this policy that this guy had. Being here from Wisconsin, our governor around the time of the Civil War, Randall Alexander, he's a guy I respect a lot because Wisconsin was the most anti-slavery and anti-racist state in the Union. And he threatened that if Lincoln wasn't elected, Wisconsin would secede from the United States, which is what the southern states did when Lincoln was elected. And then he made sure that we contributed more than our fair share of soldiers to the Civil War to go fight against the Confederate slaveholding rebels. And if you go around Wisconsin, by the way, you will see Confederate War statues, and it will usually be Union troops trampling on a rebel soldier. So, guys like that, I like quite a bit. He wasn't a statesman, but I'll say I'm cool with John Brown, okay. So Not So Oedipus has a clarification. The title of that book is Philosophical Exigencies of Christian Religion. Blanchet himself is an interesting thinker too. Yeah, he is. And actually I met him and he was a pretty cool guy. It was kind of like getting to meet a rock star. I met him at a metaphysics colloquium at St. Anselm College. He and I had correspondence before though, because I actually wrote him to ask him, why did you retranslate Oxio 1893? And he said, well, I was teaching Blondel routinely at Boston College, and Somerville's translation was so bad. I like constantly had to say, okay, the French text says this, and this Yahoo says this. And so my students were like, why don't you just do a translation yourself? And so he was like, you know what? I'm gonna. So he did. And Blanchet was a great guy. So, all right. Phenomena librarian. Do you think it's hypocrisy to date a guy who seems to have no issue with the eating of his pets while simultaneously volunteering for animal welfare because it's causing me some conflict in myself? I don't think it's hypocrisy on your part. I think that if he's volunteering for animal welfare and he's also eating sentient pets, I mean, if he had pet like oysters or something or crayfish and he's eating those, maybe that's not a big deal. But what kind of pets is he eating? I mean, if he's eating dogs and cats or raising a pig through 4-H, and like getting really close to it and then being like, all right, slaughter time, you're going to become bacon and ham. And he's also, espousing animal welfare. I think he's got some contradictions there. It wouldn't be hypocrisy on your part unless you are saying that it conflicts with something. Oh, maybe you're volunteering for animal welfare. Maybe I'm misreading this, right? So there's a guy that you're dating but he's not actually eating his pets. He just has no issue with eating his pets. That means he's not actually doing it yet. Maybe he's just being provocative or something. I think I misread it. So he's not actually eating Fluffy. But I don't think what you do have there is, let's call it a conflict. I don't think it's necessarily hypocrisy unless you're positioning yourself publicly as like a great advocate of animal welfare and you've got this dirty secret in the background, right? It'd be sort of like being I don't know, an anti-porn advocate and dating somebody who makes money on porn, making porn or something like that. Or I don't know what else could be, let's make it philosophy. You're publicly a Kantian and very devoted to Immanuel Kant and his works. And yet you're dating a person who would be, I mean, Hegel and Schopenhauer, they're both, in the wake of Kant. AJ, you're dating an AJ Arian who says that all of Kant's work is bunk. Oh, that could be a problem. So, yeah. Let's see here. Andy, oh, any Hellenistic thinkers address civic rights for the dead? Working on an essay on grief and war memorials, looking historically, looked at Cicero and Seneca. I would look in Plutarch. Um, but that's a good question. I don't know that much about like civic rights for the dead in their works. But Plutarch has a big corpus and he talks about a lot of different stuff. Maybe some of the Neoplatonists might too, That's a good question. All right. Pessimistic idealism. Love your work. Are you familiar with British idealists like F.H. Bradley or McTaggart? I recall you mentioning Bradley in one of your videos. Familiar, yes. Have I read them recently? No. They're interesting. There's also Green, who's worth checking out. So yeah, they're interesting. Let's see here. Chubby Horse, how to improve critical skills as a philosopher, student, or academic. What are the most essential skills and how to acquire them? Well, one way to improve the skills is by looking at reading other people who use those skills. So, reading Platonic dialogues and not reading them just to find the argument, but actually looking at how the people engage with each other, that can be quite helpful. One of the most essential skills, and I think this would be fostered by reading Platonic dialogues, but it would also be fostered by reading Aristotle, who is not writing dialogically, but he's engaging with a lot of thinkers, and he's saying, so-and-so says this, I agree, I disagree, is something that I see a lot of my students having trouble with, is being able to distinguish who is saying what and who is responding to it, criticizing it, reinterpreting it. So, for example, when Socrates in a Platonic dialogue says, so somebody might say this, what do you think of that? And then the interlocutor is like, yeah, I would agree with it. And then Socrates is like, well, there's a problem with that over here. Socrates has set up a position in order to criticize it. So that being able to distinguish between endorsing a position, criticizing a position, proposing a position, these different modalities, that is a really useful skill. And I guess you could design exercises to do that, but I think reading and seeing how other people are doing it is quite useful too. Diogenes, what's your relation towards poetry? Been getting into it. It's a completely different muscle when compared to reading philosophy or literature. Well, poetry is literature. And some philosophy is quite philosophical. Think of John Donne's metaphysical poetry, or, some of the stuff that T.S. Eliot has written, or Rainer Maria Rilke. I don't read much poetry, frankly. I used to write poetry quite a bit, but I haven't done that for a long time. And I suspect that I don't quite get a lot of poets. I don't appreciate what they're doing as well as I could, maybe because I don't read them enough. So I'm not a great person for talking about that. All right, so John has a clarification about the question on epistemologies, different religious perspectives of knowledge or various seemingly incompatible fields within natural science. How relevant and problematic do you think those incompatibilities are in practice, like in everyday life? Very little. I mean, how many people in everyday life are engaging with seemingly incompatible fields within natural science? A fraction of 1%, and we got to distinguish between what's actually in natural science and then what the popularizations of natural science are, which usually turn out to be wrong, and inaccurate. Different religious perspectives on knowledge. There's a whole variety of those, how relevant are they in daily life? Depends on how relevant religion is in your life, I guess. There isn't like a stock answer to that sort of thing. Okay, so we have a clarification as well from Phenomena Librarian. And we'll probably maybe do another one after that, because I got to get something to eat before I have to do another thing at the top of the hour. I volunteer for animal welfare sometime, and this guy that you're dating has no issues with eating his pets. Oh, and he seems to do it without any regret. So he actually does eat his pets, right? Which philosophy do you think can help me solve this issue? Well, you got to decide why animal welfare is important, and which animals do you care about, like all animals? Because if you do, boy, that's, if you're going to say, I can never eat an animal, produce any animal suffering, well, you can't even eat grain then, because grain is farmed and it kills the little worms as they plow the fields and all of that. So I think, asking yourself, before you worry about which philosophy can solve the issue, I think you want to clarify for yourself, where are the incompatibilities that you see here? So volunteering for animal welfare, you can certainly say that you think it's a good thing, but that doesn't mean that it is like the only commitment or the only overriding concern. I mean, I volunteer at a cat shelter, and occasionally we have to turn away people bringing in cats, because we can't just let them in there, and we have to say, you got to go to the Milwaukee area domestic animal control, and they might get euthanized there, right? So yeah, that's probably what I would try to do. But I guess you could ask, well, how important is it that I date this person? Are they, I mean, if they have no issue with eating their pets, there might be other stuff going on there, right? That might be something where the person likes to make bombastic statements, or, there's some disconnect going on in their head, All right, so I'll take this one, and then we'll wrap up. Kinetic, how does Stoic philosophy actually combat nihilistic absurdity without becoming another subjective narrative? It's not a subjective narrative, so it's kind of a non-starter right there. And it seems like you're assuming that nihilistic absurdity, which, by the way, two different things, right? Read Albert Camus, and you can find out, because he's condemning nihilism all the time, that you can have a full commitment to absurdity and yet not be nihilistic, right? But Stoic philosophy doesn't have to combat nihilistic absurdity, because who says nihilistic absurdity is actually correct, right? You got to avoid those sorts of big sweeping assumptions. And it's, a subjective narrative. Who knows what you mean by that? But Stoic philosophy is not a narrative, it's an account. And we find it throughout a bunch of works. But narrative is not the word that would adequately describe that, or Aristotelianism, or Platonism, or a lot of different things. So you probably want to rethink how you're framing that problem. So, all right, well, I'm going to bring this to a close. I got to get some food in me, because I'm getting pretty hungry before I do my philosophy chat with Patreon supporters. If you're interested in that Plato class that I mentioned at the very top, I put a link to it. You can easily find it on my YouTube channel. That's going to be a lot of fun, going through the symposium. It's one of the greatest works of Western literature, as well as a wonderful philosophical dialogue. So thanks to everybody for your questions, comments, and I will see you all somewhere down the line.